My fiancée demands that I send my 2 kids to boarding school to make room in the house for her brother. My name is Thomas. I'm 34 years old, a widower, and a father to 2 amazing kids, Ellie, who's 9, and Jason, who's 11. It's been a few tough years since my wife passed away, and life hasn't exactly been kind or simple. I've spent most of my time trying to create some semblance of normalcy for my kids, making sure they felt safe, loved, and as happy as they could be under the circumstances. My world revolved around them, and I wasn't really looking for anything or anyone else. Until Amanda. I met Amanda at a party hosted by some mutual friends. I almost didn't go. It was one of those nights when the weight of the day seemed too heavy to shake off. But my best friend practically dragged me there, insisting I needed to get out of the house. Amanda was the kind of person who lit up a room. She was confident without being overbearing, funny without trying too hard, and had this effortless charm that drew people in. When she started talking to me, I couldn't help but be captivated. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of something I thought I'd lost forever. We talked for hours that night, and it felt easy in a way I hadn't expected. She asked about Ellie and Jason, and unlike most people, her interest seemed genuine. She didn't recoil at the mention of my kids or offer platitudes about how hard it must be. Instead, she wanted to know about them, their personalities, their quirks, the things that made them laugh. It was refreshing, and honestly, it melted some of the walls I'd built around myself. Our relationship progressed quickly. Amanda seemed to fit into our lives seamlessly, like a missing puzzle piece I hadn't realized was gone. She was energetic and kind, always finding ways to bring joy into our days. She'd suggest trips to the park or movie nights at home, and she'd sit with Ellie for hours, listening to her chatter about school and friends. Jason, who's usually more reserved, started opening up to her, too. He even asked her opinion on a science project he was working on, which, for him, was a big deal. Watching them bond made me feel like maybe, just maybe, this could work. After 6 months of dating, I decided to propose. It felt fast, I'll admit, but it also felt right. Amanda had brought light back into our lives, and I couldn't ignore the way my heart swelled when I saw her with my kids. The day I proposed, she cried, happy tears, she assured me, and said yes without hesitation. The kids were cautiously excited. Ellie even asked if Amanda would be her new mom. That one hit me hard, but Amanda handled it gracefully, assuring Ellie she wasn't trying to replace anyone but would always be there for her. As we started planning the wedding, Amanda began making little suggestions about the house. At first, it was small things, replacing the curtains in the living room, moving a chair to open up the space, or switching out the kids' beds for ones she thought were more comfortable. It all seemed harmless, practical even. But there was something about the way she approached it, a quiet insistence that made me pause. She'd always phrase it as a question, a suggestion, but there was an undertone that felt less like a choice and more like an expectation. I brushed it off, convincing myself I was overthinking things. After all, blending families was bound to come with adjustments. Amanda's changes didn't seem unreasonable, and the kids didn't seem bothered. Yet, as I stood in the middle of the living room one night, looking at the new curtains she'd picked out, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered a question I couldn't quite shake: was this the start of something more? For now, I told myself it didn't matter. Things were good, and maybe that was all I needed to focus on. But the thought lingered, casting a shadow over the excitement of what was supposed to be a fresh start. Not long after Amanda and I started planning the wedding, she brought up something that caught me off guard. She mentioned her brother, Michael, had been going through a tough time. According to her, he was struggling to get back on his feet after losing his job and his apartment. She suggested he might stay with us for a while after the wedding. She said it so casually, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. I wasn't sure how to respond. My first instinct was to ask questions. How long did she think Michael would need to stay? Would this arrangement affect Ellie and Jason? What exactly had happened to him? But every time I tried to dig deeper, Amanda waved off my concerns. She assured me that Michael was a great guy who just needed a little help and that we'd figure everything out together. Still, something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. I wanted to be supportive, but I also couldn't ignore the feeling that this could complicate things in ways I wasn't prepared for. Over the next few weeks, Amanda's focus on Michael became more evident. She started bringing him up in conversations more often, always framing it as a temporary solution to a temporary problem. But her suggestions about the house began to shift. One evening, she mentioned repainting the kids' rooms. At first, it sounded like a nice idea. A fresh coat of paint could brighten things up. Then she added that it might be a good time to rethink the furniture arrangement, maybe even replace some of it. She suggested it so casually that I almost didn't notice the pattern. But then she let it slip. The changes would make it easier for Michael to settle in. I couldn't ignore the unease that was building inside me. Amanda's plans for the house started to feel less like adjustments for us and more like accommodations for her brother. I brought it up with her, trying to understand her reasoning. She brushed it off again, saying it would all work out, that Michael wouldn't want to inconvenience anyone. But the vague answers weren't helping. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was prioritizing him over the stability I'd worked so hard to create for Ellie and Jason. The kids didn't say much about the changes Amanda was proposing, but I could tell they were uneasy. Jason, in particular, seemed quieter than usual, and Ellie clung to me a little more tightly during bedtime stories. I wanted to believe it was just a phase, that they were adjusting to the idea of Amanda becoming a permanent part of our lives. But deep down, I knew better. Kids have a way of picking up on things adults try to ignore. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the weight of everything hit me all at once. Amanda's enthusiasm for the wedding, her plans for the house, her insistence on helping Michael, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite fit together. I wanted to believe she had good intentions, that this was just a rough patch we'd work through. But the nagging doubt wouldn't go away. It was as if I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't fully see yet, a storm gathering on the horizon. For now, I decided to let things play out. Maybe I was overthinking, or maybe the pieces would start to make sense as we got closer to the wedding. But as I listened to the quiet of the house that night, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was shifting, and not in a way I could control. As the weeks passed and wedding preparations moved forward, Amanda approached me with a suggestion that stopped me in my tracks. She brought it up over dinner one evening, her tone calm but firm. She proposed sending Ellie and Jason to a boarding school. She framed it as an opportunity, emphasizing how it could offer them a better education and new experiences. But the real reason became apparent as she explained how it would free up space in the house, space for Michael. I could barely process what she was saying. My kids had only just begun to find their footing after the loss of their mother. The idea of uprooting them again, sending them away from the home we'd worked so hard to stabilize, felt unthinkable. I told her as much, trying to stay composed, but inside I was reeling. Amanda brushed off my concerns, insisting it was for the best. She argued that Michael's presence in the house would only be temporary and that the kids would thrive in a structured environment away from home. The conversation escalated quickly. I laid out my reasons, explaining that Ellie and Jason needed stability more than anything. I couldn't imagine putting them through another major change just to accommodate Michael. Amanda's response surprised me. She became defensive, accusing me of being unwilling to compromise. She said that, as my future wife, she should have a say in how the house was managed and how we made decisions as a family. Her words felt like a challenge, an ultimatum disguised as a plea for partnership. For the first time, I saw a side of Amanda that I hadn't noticed before. Her insistence, the way she dismissed my concerns about the kids, felt manipulative. She started pointing out everything she'd done for us, how she'd bonded with Ellie and Jason, how she'd helped bring joy back into our lives. It was as though she was keeping a mental tally, using it to justify her demands. The person I thought I knew, the one who had seemed so understanding and kind, was suddenly unrecognizable. The tension between us only grew in the days that followed. Amanda brought up the idea of boarding school again, this time with brochures she'd printed out. She'd done her research, she said, and these schools were top tier, offering the kind of education most parents could only dream of for their kids. But no amount of glossy pamphlets could change my mind. I told her firmly that my decision was final. The kids weren't going anywhere. Her reaction caught me off guard. She accused me of being selfish, of prioritizing my children over our future together. She said I was ignoring her needs, that I didn't care about the sacrifices she'd made to be with me. It felt like every conversation was turning into a battle, with Amanda trying to wear me down while I tried to stand my ground. The more she pushed, the more I began to question everything, not just her intentions, but whether I'd been blinded by the idea of having someone to share my life with. The kids seemed to sense the tension, even if they didn't understand its source. Jason spent more time in his room, burying himself in books and projects, while Ellie clung to me even more than before. I hated that they were being affected by something they had no control over, and it only strengthened my resolve to protect them. They had already lost so much, I couldn't let them lose the sense of home we'd fought to rebuild. One night, as Amanda and I sat in the living room, the argument came to a head. She accused me of being blind to what she called the bigger picture, the idea that our lives would be better once Michael was settled and the house was rearranged to accommodate him. I told her, as calmly as I could, that my priority would always be Ellie and Jason. They were my family, my responsibility. Her response was to accuse me of not caring about her family, of being unwilling to make sacrifices for the sake of our relationship. It was in that moment that I realized how deeply our values differed. Amanda seemed to view the kids as obstacles, challenges to overcome rather than individuals with their own needs and feelings. The person I'd thought would help us heal and grow was instead threatening to upend everything I'd worked so hard to build. As I sat there, listening to her accusations, I felt a cold clarity settle over me. Something had to change, and fast. But the question was, what? By the time the argument ended, Amanda stormed off to the bedroom, leaving me alone in the silence of the living room. I stared at the brochures she'd left on the coffee table, their promises of prestige and opportunity feeling hollow and distant. My thoughts raced as I tried to piece together what had gone wrong, how we'd gone from planning a future together to standing on the edge of a divide that felt impossible to bridge. The storm I'd sensed before was no longer on the horizon. It was here, and it was only just beginning. The days following our last argument felt like walking on thin ice. Amanda's mood shifted dramatically, and her frustration became more apparent with every passing hour. It was as though the argument had opened a floodgate, and everything she'd been holding back came rushing out. One evening, she finally laid it all on the table. With a sharpness in her voice I hadn't heard before, she gave me an ultimatum: either I agreed to send Ellie and Jason to boarding school, or the wedding was off. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Amanda's tone left no room for negotiation. It wasn't a plea or a suggestion, it was a demand. Her insistence on prioritizing Michael over my children felt like a betrayal of everything I thought we'd been building together. I tried to reason with her, pointing out that we could find other ways to help her brother, but she wouldn't hear it. She accused me of being stubborn, of refusing to see how sacrifices were necessary for a successful relationship. As if her ultimatum wasn't enough, Amanda involved her family. Her relatives began calling me, each conversation more hostile than the last. They painted me as the villain, the man who was too heartless to support his fiancée's family in their time of need. The calls left me drained, and the misrepresentation of the situation stung deeply. Amanda must have shared her version of events, one that conveniently left out the well-being of my children. I tried to salvage the situation by offering compromises. I suggested we convert the guest room into a temporary space for Michael, or that I could help him financially to find a place of his own. But Amanda dismissed every idea, insisting that sending Ellie and Jason away was the only viable solution. She was unwavering, and with each rejection, the gap between us grew wider. The kids sensed the tension, and their unease became more pronounced. Jason started asking questions, his usual calm demeanor giving way to anxiety. Ellie clung to me more than ever, her bright energy dimmed by the uncertainty swirling around us. It broke my heart to see them affected like this, and it solidified my resolve. They had been through enough already. I wouldn't, put them through more turmoil to appease someone who clearly didn't have their best interests at heart. The final conversation with Amanda was as cold and unyielding as I'd feared it would be. She reiterated her ultimatum, her eyes sharp and her expression hardened. I told her I couldn't do it. I couldn't send my kids away, not for her brother, not for anyone. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. Amanda's reaction was immediate. She accused me of not valuing her, of being selfish and unwilling to make sacrifices for our family. But her version of family had always felt one-sided, revolving around her and her needs. As painful as it was, I knew what I had to do. I told Amanda the wedding was off. Her face twisted in disbelief, then anger. She tried to argue, to convince me I was making a mistake, but I'd made up my mind. The person standing in front of me was no longer the woman I'd fallen in love with. Somewhere along the way, her vision for our future had shifted into something I couldn't recognize, something I couldn't be a part of. Breaking the news to Ellie and Jason was the hardest part. I kept the explanation simple, telling them that Amanda and I had different ideas about our family's future. Jason nodded solemnly, his eyes searching mine for reassurance. Ellie wrapped her arms around me, whispering that she was glad it would just be the three of us again. Their reactions confirmed what I already knew: I'd made the right decision. In the days that followed, I reached out to Amanda's family, explaining my side of the story. Some listened, others didn't, but it didn't matter. My priority had always been Ellie and Jason, and I'd done what I believed was best for them. Amanda moved out of my life as quickly as she'd entered it, leaving behind a trail of shattered plans and unanswered questions. The house felt quieter without her, but it also felt lighter. The tension that had been building for weeks dissolved, replaced by a sense of relief I hadn't expected. Ellie and Jason seemed to thrive in the newfound calm, their laughter filling the spaces that had once been heavy with uncertainty. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in months, I felt like we were heading in the right direction. The storm had passed, and we were still standing. After the breakup, Amanda tried one last move. She insisted I pay for all the wedding expenses, including the deposits she had made for the venue, catering, and decorations, even though the event was now off. Her reasoning was as convoluted as ever, and the accusations of selfishness and irresponsibility continued. I knew better than to engage further. Instead, I sought legal advice. The lawyer I consulted assured me that I was under no obligation to cover those costs, as most of the arrangements hadn't been finalized or paid for yet. Resolving the issue quickly and decisively felt like closing the final chapter on a difficult period of my life. With Amanda gone, life returned to something resembling normal. The house felt like home again, no longer weighed down by tension and conflict. Ellie and Jason seemed to thrive in the stability that followed. Jason immersed himself in his school projects, and Ellie's laughter filled the rooms more often. We returned to our routines, savoring the little things: family movie nights, weekend trips to the park, and quiet evenings spent reading or playing games. It was the kind of peace I hadn't realized I'd been missing. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. Amanda had seemed perfect at first, but her actions revealed something deeper about her priorities. Her manipulations and ultimatums were glaring red flags I'd ignored in my eagerness to rebuild my life. Looking back, I saw how easily I'd allowed myself to overlook the small signs, convincing myself they didn't matter. It was a hard lesson, but one I wouldn't forget. I came to realize that love, real love, had to be built on mutual respect and understanding. It wasn't about one person's needs overshadowing everyone else's. It was about creating a partnership where everyone's well-being mattered. Amanda's approach had been the opposite of that, and it had taken me far too long to see it. One evening, as I was tucking Ellie into bed, she looked up at me with her big, trusting eyes and said something that stopped me in my tracks. She thanked me. She thanked me for choosing her and Jason, for putting them first. Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that made my chest tighten. In that moment, I knew I'd made the right choice. No matter how hard it had been, protecting my kids and their happiness would always be my priority. Jason joined us in the living room later, and we sat together, the three of us, sharing stories and laughing until it felt like nothing in the world could touch us. I realized then that we didn't need anyone else to complete our family. We were enough, just as we were. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I'd found my way back to solid ground. This experience taught me more than I ever expected. It reminded me to trust my instincts, to pay attention to the little signs that reveal someone's true character. Most of all, it reaffirmed what I'd always known deep down: my children were my anchor, my reason for everything. And as long as I had them, I knew I'd be okay. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stronger, more resolute version of myself. We'd weathered it together, and now, as the three of us sat in the glow of the evening light, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. This was our new beginning, and it was more than enough.